The idea of good versus evil, light versus dark, something inherent from the dawn of time, one would think, but it may not be as cut and dry as that. On this episode of Occam's Lantern, our first Delving the Deep, we'll explore and hold a light to the role of the adversary. From Tiamat to Lucifer, we will examine the devil you know, and the one you might not.
Myths and legend, history and hysteria, religion and the far reaches of the occult. These and more are the children of a common thing, belief, an intrinsic part of what makes us human. I'm your host, LiamLykos, an independent scholar of esoterica and eccentricities, a rational skeptic, father of two, writer, and lover of life. Pull up a chair, fellow lamplighters, and let us cast the shadows back a bit as we examine what lies beneath the light of Occam's Lantern.
Welcome back, fellow lamplighters, to Occam's Lantern. On today's episode, we will be doing our first Delving the Deep and casting an extended look at the adversary. The devil, the trickster, the monster at the end of the book. You've no doubt been exposed to this idea in one way or another, but we're going to stare a bit longer into the abyss as we examine the evolution from mother of monsters to devil you all know and love. But first, a bit of news. Experimentations with short-form media and advertising have proven to be pretty successful, as our viewer count from episode 4 to 5 have nearly doubled. I'd like to thank each and every follower and fan of the station for doing their part to spread the light of the lantern. Remember to send any questions or correspondence to the Facebook page for Occam's Lantern or via email at LiamLykos@zohomail.com. That's LiamLykos, all one word, at ZOHOMAIL.com. And with that said, we do have our first bit of listener mail to read. This one from Megan, who writes, "Shotgunned your first few episodes and had a question that kept fresh in my mind. If humans were so good at finding patterns that don't really exist, how do we know we're finding a real pattern and when we're fooling ourselves?" Well, Megan, first I need to address the concept of patterns that don't really exist, as you put it. It's kind of a Schrodinger's cat situation. Your observance of said pattern means it has to exist at least in some manner. As far as the validity of observation, the best way I can put it is to examine it under two extremes: rationalism and blind faith, or conspiracy. The two work on similar grounds. Rationalism tests a pattern, whereas faith protects it from scrutiny. Validity by nature means rigid under testing, and thus begs for the rational and scientific approach. Anything that shies away from this approach can be assumed as delusion and treated as such until it willingly undergoes examination. The second and final email so far reads, "Might be a weird question, but after listening to your reading of Dagon, started to wonder something. Why is it that people enjoy to be scared? Don't they get enough of that in real life? I understand roller coasters because they're exciting, but horror seems different. People voluntarily read these things or expose themselves to stories about monsters, serial killers, horrors, haunted houses, all kinds of awful things. What exactly are we getting out of that experience?" That is an excellent question, and one that merits much longer response than I have any time to offer here. There are some amazing documentaries, essays, and shorts out there about why humanity loves horror in general. I feel as though I addressed this in a roundabout way in episode 5, our episode on monsters. You can also look up In Search of Darkness series for deeper dives into horror media, as well as many brilliant videos that a basic search for the question will bring up through YouTube. Suffice to say that horror offers a safe exploration of danger, a feeling of that thrill, that adrenaline, the release of tension that it brings. We learn through the narrative presented, we explore places we seldom think about, and express an emotion and response that would normally be kept locked up tight and protected. To put it simply, it's cathartic, which is also the biggest reason I myself enjoy the medium. So, with that out of the way, let's fill up the lanterns, gather provisions, and step forth with an assured mind as we begin delving the deep. Long before the gods of Olympus, before Odin hung himself from the world tree, and millennia before the first lines of the Bible were committed to parchment, the peoples of Mesopotamia told stories beneath the shadows of ziggurats rising from the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. It was here, in what many historians call the cradle of civilization, that some of humanity's earliest myths took shape. These stories were not merely entertainment. They were attempts to explain the world itself, why rivers flooded, why storms raged, and why order emerged from chaos, and humanity found itself caught in the middle of forces far greater than itself. Among these ancient tales is one of the oldest surviving creation stories in human history, known as the Enuma Elish. In its opening lines, before there were cities, kings, or even the heavens themselves, there existed only the primordial waters. These waters were divided into two great beings, Apsu, the fresh, and Tiamat, the salt water. Together, they represented the chaotic, undifferentiated state of existence before creation. They weren't evil. They were not monsters in the sense we often think of today. They were simply the raw and untamed forces from which all things would eventually emerge. As the story unfolds, younger gods are born from these primordial waters. Their activity and noise disrupt the ancient order represented by Apsu and Tiamat. Conflict follows, as it often does in mythology. Apsu is ultimately slain by the younger gods, leaving Tiamat enraged and seeking vengeance. It's here that she undergoes a transformation that would echo through thousands of years of storytelling. No longer merely the sea itself, Tiamat becomes an embodiment of primordial chaos. She gathers monstrous allies, creating terrifying creatures to serve her, and prepares for war against the younger generation of gods. Standing against her is the storm god Marduk. The battle between the two is not simply a fight between heroes and villains, it's a cosmic struggle between order and chaos, civilization and the untamed wilderness, the known world and the terrifying unknown. Marduk ultimately triumphs, slaying Tiamat and dividing her body in two. From one half he fashions the heavens, and from the other the earth. In a very literal sense, the world is built from the body of chaos itself. What makes Tiamat fascinating is that she represents one of humanity's earliest attempts to personify a concept that appears again and again throughout mythology. Nearly every culture tells some version of this story: serpent, dragon, monster of the deep, a force of chaos that must be overcome so that the world can exist. We see echoes of Tiamat in the Egyptian serpent, Apep, in the Norse Jormungandr, in the dragons of medieval Europe, and perhaps even in modern depictions of world-ending monsters and kaiju. Though her name is ancient, her role remains remarkably familiar, and perhaps that's why Tiamat deserves a place in any discussion of not only adversaries, but monsters in general. She's not merely one of the first recorded in human history. She's one of the first examples of such serving a purpose beyond simply fear. She gives form to humanity's oldest anxiety, the fear that order is fragile, that civilization stands atop a foundation of chaos, and that beyond the light of our campfires, the primordial darkness still awaits. The ancient Egyptians viewed the universe as a delicate thing, Unlike many modern perspectives that take the rising of the sun for granted, the Egyptians saw order as something that had to be maintained constantly against the ever-present threat of chaos. Their world depended on the annual flooding of the Nile, the predictable movements of the stars, and the daily journey of the sun across the sky. When those patterns held, civilizations flourished. When they faltered, famine, disorder, and death followed. It is within this worldview that we find one of history's most enduring adversaries, Apep. Known to the Greeks as Apophis, Apep was a colossal serpent who embodied chaos, darkness, and unmaking. Unlike the gods worshipped throughout Egypt, Apep had no temples, no priesthood, and no cult devoted to his veneration. He was not a deity to be appeased or honored. He was a threat to the existence of life itself. Each night, as the sun god Ra journeyed through the underworld aboard his solar bark, Apep waited in the darkness. There he would attack the vessel, seeking to devour the sun and plunge the world into eternal night. What makes Apep particularly fascinating is that he was never truly defeated. Every dawn marked a victory over the serpent, but it was only a temporary one. The battle would begin anew the following night, and in this way, Apep represents a very different kind of adversary than we find in later traditions. He is not a rebel seeking power. He's not a tempter offering forbidden knowledge, nor is he a villain with motives or ambitions. He is simply the eternal reminder that order is fragile, and that chaos waits patiently at its borders, much as an echo of Tiamat. The Egyptians developed rituals to aid in this nightly struggle. Priests recited incantations, performed symbolic acts, and sometimes created images that were ritually destroyed. These ceremonies were not merely religious observances, they were expressions of a broader belief that humanity itself played a role in preserving order against the forces of disorder. The battle against chaos was not solely the responsibility of the gods. It was a responsibility shared by civilization itself. Seen through a modern lens, Apep occupies a unique place in the history of monsters and adversaries, as he is one of humanity's earliest personifications of entropy, the fear that everything we build can be undone, that every wall can crumble, and that every light can be extinguished. Thousands of years later, we continue to tell similar stories. We may no longer imagine a giant serpent lurking beneath the horizon waiting to swallow the sun, but we still fear that collapse, disorder, and unknown. The shape of the adversary changes, but the underlying anxiety remains remarkably familiar. And if Tiamat represented the primordial chaos from which the world emerged, Apep represented the chaos waiting to reclaim it. Between these two figures, we can see humanity's oldest recurring themes, the belief that order is neither permanent nor guaranteed, but something that must be defended against the darkness beyond the firelight. Among the great civilizations of the ancient world, few would shape humanity's understanding of good and evil more profoundly than the Persians. At the heart of their religious tradition, known today as Zoroastrianism, stood a vision of the cosmos unlike anything we have encountered thus far. Where earlier myths often described struggles between generations of gods or the eternal tension between order and chaos, Zoroastrian thought framed existence itself as a battleground between opposing principles. On one side stood Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, associated with truth, light, wisdom, and creation. Opposing him was Angra Mainyu, known more commonly by the later name of Ahriman. Unlike Tiamat or Apep, Ahriman was not merely destructive. He was actively hostile to all that was good, ordered, and life-giving. Representative of deception, corruption, suffering, disease, and death itself. If Ahura Mazda sought to create, Ahriman sought to spoil. If Ahura Mazda embodied truth, Ahriman embodied the lie. Now, this distinction might seem subtle, but it marks a profound shift in the evolution of the adversary archetype. Earlier monsters threatened humanity because they were dangerous. A storm could destroy a village, a serpent could strike without warning, and chaos could easily swallow civilization. Ahriman represented something different. He was not feared merely because of what he could do. He was feared because of what he stood for. The adversary had become moralized. The struggle was no longer simply survival against the wilderness. It was a conflict between right and wrong, truth and falsehood. The influence of this idea would echo far beyond Persia. Historians continue to debate the precise nature and extent of that influence, but many note the striking parallels between Zoroastrian concepts and later religious traditions. The notion of a cosmic struggle between forces of good and evil, of beneficial and malevolent spiritual beings, and of a final triumph of order over chaos. These ideas would become familiar to billions of people across the centuries that followed through the evolution of Abrahamic religions and other similar ideals. Yet, Ahriman remains distinct from the devils that would come later. He's not a tempter whispering in the ear of mankind. He's not a rebel angel cast down from heaven. Nor does he seek redemption, power, or worship. He's a force of opposition itself, the embodiment of everything that seeks to undermine creation and drag it towards ruin. For the first time in our journey, the adversary is no longer a monster lurking behind the village walls. He has become a philosophical concept, an explanation for suffering, a personification of humanity's enduring question: if goodness exists, why does evil exist as well? Now, if we were to stop our journey here, it would be tempting to conclude that humanity's conception of the adversary follows a simple progression. Chaos becomes destruction, becomes evil, becomes active force opposed to truth, order, and goodness. In many ways, Ahriman feels remarkably similar and familiar to modern audiences because we've inherited centuries of stories built upon these foundations. But history rarely follows a straight line. Not every culture viewed the forces of disruption and disorder as inherently malevolent. While the Persians imagined a cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, other peoples arrived at a very different conclusion. To them, chaos was not always the enemy. Sometimes it was a nuisance, and other times a catalyst. Hell, sometimes even necessary. In the cold and often unforgiving world of the Norse, where harsh winters, unpredictable seas, and the sudden violence of everyday living were simple facts of life, one of mythology's most famous adversaries emerged. He was neither demon nor devil. He wasn't an embodiment of evil or an enemy of all creation. He drank right beside the gods, traveled with them, aided them when it suited, and undermined them when it didn't. His name was Loki. And unlike the primordial monsters and cosmic adversaries that came before him, Loki forces us to ask a very different question. What if the adversary is not the thing destroying the world? What if it's the thing that's preventing the world from standing still? Modern audiences often encounter Loki through films, comic books, and pop culture, where he is frequently presented as the Norse equivalent of the devil. Yet, the original myths paint a far more complicated picture. Loki's not a ruler of an underworld, nor is he an embodiment of direct evil. He's a trickster, a shapeshifter, a schemer, figure who exists at the edges of order and disorder, belonging fully to neither. Throughout the surviving Norse tales, Loki is responsible for some of the gods' greatest troubles. His schemes lead to disaster, betrayal, and humiliation, yet just as often he's the one that helps solve the very problem he creates. When the gods find themselves in danger, Loki's wit frequently becomes their salvation. Time and time again, he proves both indispensable and infuriating. This duality is what makes Loki so significant in the history of the adversary archetype. Unlike Epep, who seeks only destruction, Loki's role is transformative. His actions force change. He exposes weaknesses, challenges assumptions, and disrupts comfortable patterns. In many ways, he serves as a reminder that growth often arrives through discomfort, and that order left entirely unchallenged can become stagnant. Perhaps the most famous example comes in the events leading to Ragnarok, the prophesied end of the world. By this point, Loki has become increasingly hostile to the gods, and his actions contribute directly to the coming catastrophe. Yet, even here the story is more nuanced than a simple battle between good and evil. Ragnarok is not merely an ending, it is also a beginning. The destruction of the old world gives rise to a new. Once again, chaos serves as the catalyst for this transformation. The shift to Loki reveals an important evolution in humanity's understanding of the adversary. Ancient cultures feared chaos as something external, a force threatening to swallow the sun itself. The Norse, living in a harsh and unpredictable world, had their own version of this, but also imagined something far more intimate. Their adversaries sat at the same table as the gods themselves, laughed with them, and traveled beside them, as I said. Chaos was no longer simply outside the walls. It had become a part of the integral community itself. And perhaps that idea feels more familiar to us than a giant serpent devouring the sun, or a wolf, in the case of the Norse. Most of us do not fear primordial monsters lurking in the darkness. We fear the unexpected disruption, the difficult question, the inconvenient truth, the friend who challenges our assumptions. And in Loki, humanity's adversary had become something far more recognizable, the force that unsettles certainty and compels change. Loki's enduring appeal lies in the fact that he occupies a space few mythological figures have ever managed to inhabit. He's neither hero nor villain. He's a force that upsets the balance. The stone thrown into still water, a question that arrives at an inconvenient moment. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about the trickster is that Loki is far from unique. Thousands of miles away from the fjords and longhouses of Scandinavia, among people who would most likely have never heard the name Loki and shared no common mythology with the Norse, another figure emerged who filled a remarkably similar role. Different stories, different landscapes, yet somehow the same archetype appeared once again. This time beneath the vast skies and open plains of North America, the trickster took the form of Coyote. And among many indigenous peoples of North America, Coyote appears as one of the most enduring and recognizable figures in mythology. While the details vary widely between nations and traditions, certain themes emerge again and again. Cleverness, curious, impulsive, selfish, generous, foolish, wise, often all within the same story. Like Loki, they defy simple categorization. In some tales, Coyote helps shape the world itself. They steal fire for humanity, bring knowledge to the people, alter landscapes, almost a Promethean role. Yet these acts of generosity are frequently accompanied by arrogance, greed, and foolishness. No sooner have they solved one problem than creating another. Victory is often followed by embarrassment, humiliation, and disaster. What makes Coyote particularly fascinating is that his stories rarely present them as a figure to be worshipped or emulated. Instead, they serve as a teacher through negative example. They're the embodiment of human flaws placed under a magnifying glass. Their vanity becomes absurdity, greed becoming catastrophic, And through their failures, listeners learn lessons about humility, patience, wisdom, and self-control. In one particular story, Coyote's impatience lead them to disregarding instruction and unleashing consequences they cannot contain. In another, their hunger and selfishness leave them humiliated. Again and again, the lesson remains the same. Actions have consequences, and wisdom often comes through failure rather than success. Unlike Ahriman, who stands opposed to goodness itself, or Apep, who seek destruction of order, Coyote and Loki occupy a far more complicated role. They're disruptive, but not necessarily malicious. They create chaos, revealing truths hidden behind comfortable assumptions, and their stories remind us that growth is rarely neat, and that mistakes can be among life's most effective teachers. Perhaps this is why trickster figures appear so consistently throughout human mythology. Every society values order, but every society also recognizes the unquestioned order that can become stagnant. Figures like Loki, Coyote, Anansi arrive to upset the routine, challenge convention, and expose hypocrisy, forcing the adaptation of mankind. They might be frustrating or even dangerous, but they are rarely pointless. Through these, we begin to see a different vision of the adversary emerge. Not a monster to be slain or a devil to be feared, but a catalyst, a force of disruption that, paradoxically, helps societies examine themselves and evolve. As we move westward throughout history, however, we encounter a very different kind of adversary, one that is neither monster nor cosmic entity. Instead, we find a figure whose purpose is far more deliberate. For many listeners, the name Satan immediately conjures images of devils, demons, and eternal punishment, the ultimate enemy of God. Yet, the earliest appearances of the figure that would eventually become Satan present something quite differently. In fact, the earliest may be less comparable to the King of Hell than to a prosecutor in a courtroom. To understand how dramatic this transformation would become, we must first meet the adversary before he became the adversary. The word Satan originates from the Hebrew term ha-satan, meaning the adversary or the accuser. In its earliest usage, it's not necessarily a personal name at all. Rather, it describes a role, an opponent, a challenger, one who questions and scrutinizes. This distinction is important because the earliest biblical appearances of ha-satan differ dramatically from the image familiar to modern audiences. Rather than acting as God's direct enemy, ha-satan appears to function within the divine order itself. Their role is not to wage war against heaven, but to test, investigate, and challenge. Nowhere is this more evident than in the book of Job. In the story, Job is presented as a righteous and faithful man. His devotion is unquestioned, his conduct exemplary. It is ha-satan who raises a challenge. Is Job truly virtuous, he asks, or is he merely prosperous? Would his faith survive hardship? Remove the blessings, strip away the comforts, and what remains? What follows is, well, brutal and austere to the eyes of a non-believer, one of the most profound examinations of suffering found in ancient literature. Job loses his wealth, his family, his health, and nearly everything that once defined his life, yet throughout the ordeal, the adversary is not acting independently of God. He is not attempting a rebellion. He's not seeking to overthrow heaven. Instead, he's merely functioning as the long arm of God, the one who is asking the difficult questions and subjecting certainty to examination. In many ways, ha-satan occupies a role surprisingly similar to that of the prosecutor. His purpose is not to create evil, but to reveal truth. He challenges assumptions and demands evidence. If someone declares them self-righteous, Ha-Satan asks whether that righteousness can truly endure the storm. This places him at a fascinating position within our exploration of the adversary archetype. Tiamat threatened creation, Apep sought its destruction, Ahriman opposed goodness itself, the trickster disrupted order to reveal truths, Ha-Satan represents something new entirely, the adversary as examiner. It's an uncomfortable role. Few people enjoy having their beliefs, convictions, or character tested, yet history repeatedly demonstrates the value of scrutiny. Claims that cannot survive questioning are rarely strong, and ideas that collapse under examination are hardly reliable. For a podcast dedicated to skepticism and inquiry, there's something almost poetic about this earliest adversary. Long before Satan became the horned devil of medieval imagination, he served as a reminder that certainty deserves challenge and that truth is often revealed through examination rather than acceptance. The great irony is that one of history's most feared figures may have begun not as an enemy of the truth, but as one of its most relentless investigators. By now, you might see a pattern emerging. The adversary is not a fixed character. It is a role, a reflection of what a culture fears, values, or seeks to understand. Yet, when most people hear the word Satan today, they think of none of these things. Instead, they imagine a fallen angel, a proud being cast from heaven, a rebel against divine authority, the ruler of hell. Curiously, this figure does not fully emerge from any singular source. Rather, it is assembled over centuries from fragments of scripture, interpretation, folklore, and imagination. To understand the modern devil, we must first meet the Lightbringer. The name Lucifer carries enormous cultural weight. It evokes images of rebellion, temptation, forbidden knowledge, and the eternal struggle between heaven and hell. Yet the origins of the name are surprisingly mundane. The word itself comes from Latin, meaning light-bringer or morning star. It was used to describe the planet Venus when it appeared before sunrise. In ancient world, the brilliant star visible just before dawn became a powerful symbol, one that found its way into poetry, mythology, and eventually religious texts. One of the most influential passages appears in the book of Isaiah, where a taunt is directed towards the king of Babylon. The text mocks a ruler whose pride led to his downfall, comparing him to the morning star that rises brilliantly only to disappear within the coming of day. When the Hebrew text was translated into Latin centuries later, the phrase was rendered using the word Lucifer. What is striking is the passage itself is not explicitly about Satan. It concerns a human king, arrogance, and the consequence of hubris, yet over centuries, readers began connecting this imagery with other passages discussing fallen heavenly beings, rebellious angels, and cosmic conflict. Gradually, disparate traditions began to emerge. As Christianity developed, the image of Lucifer absorbed elements from multiple sources: the adversarial figure from Job, the serpent of Eden, apocalyptic dragons, fallen angels, and ancient enemies of divine order. What emerged was not merely a challenger or examiner, but the ultimate rebel. This transformation reached one of its most influential forms in the 17th century through the works of John Milton. In his epic poem Paradise Lost, Milton presents Satan as intelligent, charismatic, eloquent, and tragically proud. Though Milton intended him as a cautionary figure, readers across the centuries found themselves captivated by him. Milton's Satan doesn't simply oppose God. He rejects submission itself. Faced with defeat, he famously declares that it is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Whether one interprets this as courage, arrogance, self-delusion, or defiance, the statement helped shape the modern imagination more than perhaps any theological text before or since. For the first time on our journey, the adversary becomes something deeply human. Not chaos, not destruction, not even temptation. Pride, ambition, the refusal to accept one's place. Lucifer's story endures because it speaks to questions that continue to haunt us. How much authority should be challenged? When does independence become arrogance? When does conviction become rebellion? In many aspects, Lucifer represents the culmination of the adversary archetype. Within him, we find echoes of every figure we've encountered thus far. The chaos of Tiamat, the opposition of Ahriman, the challenge of Ha-Satan, and the destruction of Loki and Coyote. Yet, he is also something entirely new. An adversary is a conscious rebel, standing in opposition not because of instinct or nature, but simply because they choose to do so. Whether viewed as villain, cautionary tale, tragic figure, or symbol of defiance, Lucifer remains one of humanity's most enduring attempts to wrestle with a question as old as civilization itself. What happens when an individual decides the established order is no longer worthy of obedience? And after what might be our longest trek yet into the unknown, I feel it's at this time we should take a bit of a rest. Pour a strong drink, loosen ourselves a bit, and step into the decompression chamber to ask, so what does the devil look like today? So, the first thing that comes to mind when it comes to the devil in film is, I believe it was the first horror movie ever, Le Manoir du Diable. I cannot pronounce French for the life of me, so forgive that. But it was a delightful little short film made in Paris, 1896. It was rediscovered in 1980 after a remarkably high-quality copy was found. Georges Méliès, who was the director and writer of it, I believe, but he was formerly a stage magician and was, on top of that, a pioneer of cinema, obviously, casting himself as Mephistopheles. I find it fascinating that the very first devil on film appeared only a year after the Lumiere brothers helped launch cinema itself. Humanity invented movies and almost immediately put the devil in one. We just couldn't help ourselves. Moving on from that, the next biggest example I can come up with has got to obviously be Faust. Another silent film, much more entrenched into the genre, the prime era people associate with. Murnau's masterclass in German expressionism again depicts Mephistopheles, who's quickly becoming the go-to silver screen devil. And this movie kind of laid the bedrock for that charismatic devil that would come. Faustian became the go-to term for making a deal with the devil. The movie opens on a wager scene that easily reflects the Ha-Satan bit of acting as judiciary rather than straight-up tempter. Without this movie, I don't think we get any of the future suave portrayals, at least as handily, without this one. And what I mean by that is we look at Manoir some 30 years before, and the devil is a trickster doing parlor tricks, sleight of hand, very pitchfork, very funny, very amusing. But in Faust, it's a full examination of temptation, morality, desire. And it's necessary to note, especially before I move on to the next few examples, that he doesn't force Faust's hand. He gives him the rope and lets him do the rest. And I'm not going to do an exhaustive list of every single movie that the devil makes an appearance. I'm just going to hit the key ones that came to mind that I took notes of. With that in mind, we go straight to the age of panic, when the devil takes a jump from being a novelty, and he really was back before the satanic panic. I mean, like, nobody... I mean, I'm sure there were, churchgoers, things like that, the devil, but, I mean, society at large, the devil was stylish. He was fashionable. It's something you put on designs and stuff. You look at deviled eggs and deviled ham that straight up had Mephistopheles himself right on the cover. But, the panic hits and that all disappears, and enter 1973 when The Exorcist takes stage. Now, Blatty's work as a whole was thematically about loss of faith, human suffering, free will, and sacrifice. Themes I think were much better explored in his novel Legion, but none of that was what made the film the absolute juggernaut that it was. I mean, the sheer horror and torment of the innocent dialed in perfectly to the hysteria of the masses, leading to droves of curious moviegoers and what could probably be one of the best examples of turning protest into profit. Funny enough, despite the Catholic trappings, the entity in the movie self-identifies as Pazuzu, a Mesopotamian wind deity associated with plagues, not actually Satan himself. And now this was preceded by and followed with a deluge of these malevolent demon monster possession portrayals taking center stage that are still happening to this day, but as the panic and hysteria died off, we see a breath of fresh air with Robert De Niro in 1987's Angel Heart, one of my favorites, and not really one that's talked about as much as the others, so I think I'm going to go a little bit longer on this one. And what makes this so unique is that De Niro's character, and I gotta say, the name is a bit on the nose, but I've seen it go right over some people's heads. Lucifer. Yeah, Lucifer. But back on track, his character is more of a framing device than anything. He's not tempting and torturing or turning into a bat, making people throw up pea soup. He's just patient, waiting, calculating. Much more, again, of a Hasatan, figure of judgment. We see the classic Faustian deal, but it's with a tertiary character. The protagonist is called in to help find this missing singer, Johnny Favorite. Now, the devil here is conducting an audit. Nothing more, nothing less. Cypher never threatens, never pushes, never tempts. He holds up a mirror, and when Mickey Rourke's central character of Harry Angel gets scared by the reflection, we assume it's the devil's work. But the truth is a lot more complicated than that. De Niro doesn't play as someone with something to win. He plays it as someone who's already won before the pieces even come out. I mean, the eggs, the subtlety about it. Think about everything that eggs symbolize, right? Life, souls, humanity, birth, like, not humanity, obviously, but you get what I'm saying. But every scene, he's there, just casually devouring them. And most people don't even think twice about it, because it's never really brought to attention. He's just casually there, eating eggs. He's just peeling an egg, eating it, and it has nothing to do with the scene itself. So a lot of people, And that level of undertone is why I really appreciate this flick. Cypher never really lies. He might mislead, omit, or nudge, but for the most part, he tells Harry exactly what's happening from the start. But again, Harry's scared of that reflection, The devil's just showing him the truth, warts and all. And it pairs pretty nicely with Devil's Advocate, which does similar notes of the whole I'm just giving you what you asked for, with Pacino playing a slightly more hedonistic and indulgent devil, who again doesn't really do anything but let the lead dig his own grave. And we see at the end a bit of redemption, a lesson learned. There's this whole subplot dealing with, who the lead really is and all this stuff. But honestly, you can't have the devil be a good guy. So naturally his plans are foiled and the protagonist changes his mind. But honestly, I think it's a little bit more subtle than that. Like, I gotta wonder how much of it was... I'm just reading into it on my own here. But, the examples could go on and on and on and on. But the quick list of ones that I personally enjoy, Keanu Reeves has a second encounter after Devil's Advocate and Constantine much later, where the ever-great Peter Stormare steals every second of his short screen time as a Lucifer whose smug amusement is more akin to an executive coming in to inspect the project than an ever-present evil. The remake of Bedazzled with Liz Hurley, yeah, it was a goofy, silly popcorn flick, but my God, was she hot. Another example of the careful what you wish for, devil may care. Shows from Twilight Zone to Supernatural, South Park to Sandman, each throwing every bit of lore and silly inanity into the blender and letting it hit a wall in a deep, interesting, or off-kilter extravagance. One I will take a second to explore is Lucifer. Tom Ellis knocked this out of the park. And, Neil Gaiman, as problematic as his behavior was a masterful writer in weaving fairy tale, mythology, human emotion, wit, and charm. Tom Ellis's seductive, slick, yet endearing and emotionally gripping Lucifer Morningstar is beyond what we see of Lucifer and Sandman. And Sandman was a work of art. Don't get me wrong here. But Tom Ellis's Lucifer, forgive the pun, shining example of a disillusioned devil on holiday. And it's one of those rare examples of the devil taking center stage. Usually it's one or two moments of sheer density of personification that steals the show and leaves an impression, as is the case in Robert Eggers' The Witch. Wouldst thou like to live deliciously? Oh, yes. Yes, I would. Now, before we get into the closing, I want to offer up one last example. Charlie Daniels. Devil Went Down to Georgia. I have a theory about this tale. See, I think the devil totally succeeded in his plan. It was never about the fiddle. He got Johnny's soul, hook, line, and sinker. Think about it. He lures him into a Faustian deal, offers him riches in the form of a golden fiddle, played off his pride, lured him into temptation. Johnny, I told you once, a son of a biscuit, I'm the best that's ever been. You can tell I'm a parent. I do substitutions like that all the time. But, Johnny, that doesn't sound very Christian of you. And there's no way in hell the devil would play music that badly. So, in closing, it's plain to see that even in media, the devil rarely wins by force. They win by convincing someone else to make a choice. Whether it's Faust, Eve, Dorian Gray, or Johnny and his fiddle, the adversary's greatest weapon has never been power. It's always been persuasion. And why do you think this is? Personally, I think it's an inversion of humanity's fear. Fear that they will never be enough, not without that bargain, not without that temptation. And then the heroes, quote-unquote, who have been molded by the modern Abrahamic conditioning, well, they will do it on their own with their God-given gifts. And humility, too. Usually. Yeah, okay, not so much. And that gets us into the cornerstones of Satanism. The devil is a representation of our hidden side, our strengths, our desires, a potential that so many are conditioned to fear because there's so much in society that seeks to keep us in line, down and looking to outside assistance for success at the low, low price of, well, whatever you gotta pay. But I'll tell you a secret. Look into that reflection that's getting held up. Maybe you'll be like Harry Angel and look away and be afraid, or you just might like what you see and get what you want. Because when you speak of the devil, you might be speaking in third person. Thank you for listening. Let me know what you think about our first delving into the deep. I'm going to be taking a somewhat short break before we hit lucky episode 7, and oh boy, have we got a fun one. So what do tarot, Jung, and JRPGs have in common? Join us next time in the light of the lantern as we illuminate a game series celebrating its 30th anniversary this year, Persona. Until then, keep the fire stoked and the lanterns full. This has been LiamLykos, and you've been listening to Occam's Lantern.